Your life rarely changes all at once. It changes through decisions, through habits, through small actions repeated long enough to shape who you become. People often say it takes many days to build a habit, but a single week of deliberate action can reveal more about a person's character than months of good intentions. 7 days. That's all it takes to realize that most of what was holding me back wasn't a lack of knowledge, talent, or opportunity. It was habits, quiet habits, invisible habits, the kind that slowly shape a life while you're busy looking elsewhere. The Stoics believed a person's destiny is shaped by daily actions, not grand ambitions. Yet so many people spend years waiting for motivation, waiting for confidence, waiting for the perfect moment to begin. Meanwhile, their days are consumed by distractions, excuses, and routines that quietly lead them nowhere. The uncomfortable truth is that life rarely changes when circumstances change. Life changes when behavior changes, and once behavior changes, everything else begins to follow. There is a reason some people remain calm in chaos, focused when others are distracted, and disciplined when others give up. It is not luck, it is not talent. It is the result of small choices repeated long enough to become part of who they are. That realization changed the way I understood growth, discipline, and even myself. Because the quality of a life is rarely determined by a single decision, it is determined by the habits that quietly shape every day that follows. Small habits matter far more than they appear to. Every time a promise is broken, the mind notices. Every time an excuse replaces action, the mind notices that too. These moments may seem insignificant, but they accumulate. They shape self-perception in ways that often go unnoticed. Over time, a person begins forming conclusions about themselves based on repeated behavior, not based on intentions, not based on goals, based on evidence. The same principle works in the opposite direction. Every completed habit becomes a piece of evidence. Every act of follow-through sends a message. It says that your word means something. It says that your actions can be trusted. This kind of trust cannot be purchased, borrowed, or faked. It is built gradually, one decision at a time, one ordinary day at a time. Eventually, something remarkable begins to happen. Discipline stops feeling like punishment. It starts feeling like self-respect. The habit itself may remain small, but the identity being built around it becomes stronger. And once a person begins believing their own word, the foundation for every future change is already in place. That question carries more power than it initially seems. Most people assume that discipline exists to produce results. They believe the purpose of consistency is to achieve a desired outcome somewhere in the future. While outcomes certainly matter, something far more important happens long before any visible reward arrives. Discipline begins shaping identity. Every action becomes evidence. Every repeated behavior becomes a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. The mind is constantly observing these patterns, even when conscious attention is elsewhere. It notices who shows up and who makes excuses. It notices who follows through and who delays. Over time, these observations become beliefs. Eventually, those beliefs become part of a person's self-image. This is why lasting change is never simply about achieving goals. It is about becoming someone capable of achieving them consistently. The challenge is that modern culture often teaches the opposite lesson. People are encouraged to focus on dramatic transformations. Overnight success stories receive attention. Extraordinary achievements receive praise. Massive breakthroughs dominate conversations. Yet the reality of growth is usually much quieter. Most meaningful progress happens through ordinary actions repeated over long periods of time. The day itself often feels uneventful. There are no celebrations, no applause, no visible signs that anything significant is happening. But beneath the surface, important changes are taking place. Character is being shaped. Habits are becoming stronger. Patterns are being established. The future is being influenced by choices that seem almost insignificant in the moment. This is why many people abandon progress too early. They expect transformation to feel dramatic when it often feels remarkably ordinary. The Stoics understood this reality deeply. They rarely spoke about greatness as something that suddenly appeared. Instead, they viewed character as something constructed through repeated action. Virtue was not inherited. Wisdom was not inherited. Courage was not inherited. These qualities were developed through practice, day after day, decision after decision. They recognized that every situation presented an opportunity to strengthen or weaken the qualities a person wished to cultivate. Small moments mattered because small moments eventually became a life. As Aristotle observed, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit. A person did not become resilient during a crisis. They became resilient through countless smaller moments that prepared them for the crisis when it eventually arrived. The same principle applies to every area of growth. The ability to remain focused, disciplined, patient, or composed is rarely created in a single moment. It is built gradually through repetition. This perspective changes the way setbacks are viewed as well. When identity becomes the focus, rather than immediate results, temporary failures lose much of their power. A missed day no longer feels like proof of inadequacy. It becomes a reminder to return to the process. There is an important difference between failing at a task and becoming a failure as a person. Yet many people confuse the two. They allow one mistake to define their entire perception of themselves. They interpret a setback as evidence that they are incapable of change. But growth does not require perfection. It requires persistence. The person who continues after a mistake often develops more strength than the person who never encountered difficulty at all. Progress is not measured by flawless execution. It is measured by the willingness to continue despite imperfection. This is where small actions reveal their true value. They create opportunities to practice consistency without becoming overwhelmed by complexity. A single habit may seem insignificant on its own, but it teaches lessons that extend far beyond the habit itself. It teaches patience. It teaches reliability. It teaches self-respect. Most importantly, it teaches the mind that effort can be trusted. Once that lesson is learned, new possibilities begin to emerge naturally. The need for constant motivation starts fading because motivation is no longer carrying the entire burden. Systems begin carrying part of that weight. Routines begin carrying part of that weight. Identity begins carrying part of that weight. What once felt difficult starts feeling normal. What once required willpower starts becoming automatic. As these patterns strengthen, the relationship with the future changes as well. Anxiety begins losing some of its influence because attention is no longer trapped in distant outcomes. Focus returns to daily actions. The next step becomes more important than the final destination. There is a certain freedom in that approach. Life feels less like a race toward an uncertain finish line and more like a series of meaningful choices made in the present moment. Ironically, this often produces better results than constant obsession with outcomes ever could. When attention remains grounded in what can actually be controlled, progress becomes more sustainable. The future begins improving quietly, almost invisibly, because the patterns shaping that future are improving first. And when daily patterns begin changing, a person's life often starts changing long before they fully realize it. If these ideas are helping you see yourself a little more clearly, consider subscribing. To spend more time with ideas that strengthen character, sharpen judgment, and bring greater intention to everyday life. Because growth rarely happens in a single moment of inspiration. More often, it happens through repeated reflection, honest observation, and the willingness to improve one small decision at a time. The more I thought about consistency, the more I realized that most people are not losing battles against laziness. They are losing battles against distraction. That distinction matters because the solution changes completely depending on how the problem is understood. It is easy to blame a lack of discipline when progress stalls. It is easy to assume that stronger willpower is the missing piece. But often the issue runs deeper than that. The modern world competes for attention with an intensity that previous generations never experienced. Every device, every platform, every notification is designed to pull awareness away from the present moment and direct it somewhere else. The result is a mind that is constantly reacting but rarely reflecting, constantly consuming but rarely creating, constantly busy but rarely moving in a meaningful direction. This is why so many people end their days feeling exhausted despite accomplishing very little. Their energy has been spent responding rather than choosing. At first, these interruptions seem harmless. A quick glance at a message, a few minutes scrolling through updates, a brief distraction between tasks. Each moment feels insignificant on its own. Yet the real cost is not measured in minutes. It is measured in fragmented attention. Every interruption leaves something behind. A portion of the mind remains attached to what it has just seen, heard, or experienced. Focus becomes divided. Clarity begins to fade. Deep thinking becomes harder to sustain. As Seneca observed, to be everywhere is to be nowhere. Over time, this fragmented state starts to feel normal. Many people become so accustomed to distraction that stillness feels uncomfortable. Silence feels unfamiliar. Undivided attention feels almost unnatural. The mind begins seeking stimulation automatically, even when that stimulation no longer serves any meaningful purpose. The Stoics understood something that remains profoundly relevant today. A person who cannot govern their attention will eventually struggle to govern their life. Thoughts influence actions, actions influence habits, habits influence outcomes. If attention is constantly directed by external forces, then choices gradually become shaped by those same forces. This is why mental independence requires more than intelligence. It requires awareness. It requires the ability to pause before reacting, to observe before responding, to decide consciously where energy will be invested. Without that ability, life can become a series of automatic reactions to whatever happens to appear in front of us. Days begin filling themselves. Weeks begin passing unnoticed. Progress becomes difficult to identify because intention has been replaced by impulse. The consequences are often subtle at first. Goals remain important in theory, but less important in practice. Time is still available, yet it somehow disappears. Plans are still being made, yet they rarely move forward. Many people assume they need more hours in the day, when what they truly need is greater ownership of the hours they already have. This realization can be uncomfortable because it shifts responsibility inward. It removes the excuse that circumstances are entirely to blame. The truth is that meaningful goals require sustained attention, and sustained attention cannot exist where constant distraction is allowed to flourish. The issue is rarely capability. Most people are capable of far more than they realize. The issue is that their focus is being scattered across too many competing priorities. I began noticing this pattern in my own life, not through some dramatic revelation, but through ordinary observation. There were moments when I felt busy from morning until evening, yet struggled to identify what had actually been accomplished. The effort was real, the activity was real, yet the results felt strangely disconnected from the energy being invested. That contradiction forced me to examine where my attention was going. The answer was not flattering. Small distractions had become routine. Minor interruptions had become habits. Moments that seemed harmless in isolation were accumulating into hours of lost focus. More importantly, they were shaping the quality of my thinking. Deep reflection was becoming rare because shallow stimulation was becoming constant. Once that became clear, protecting attention started feeling less like a productivity strategy and more like an act of self-respect. Valuable things are protected. Time is protected. Money is protected, health is protected. Yet attention, perhaps one of the most valuable resources a person possesses, is often left completely exposed. The mind absorbs whatever enters its environment. Conversations influence thinking. Information influences perception. Repeated exposure influences belief. Whether these influences are helpful or harmful, they leave an imprint. Recognizing this creates a different relationship with daily choices. Suddenly, every source of attention becomes worthy of examination. Not every piece of information deserves access to the mind. Not every distraction deserves a response. Not every opinion deserves consideration. The process of reclaiming focus was not dramatic. It began with small adjustments, fewer unnecessary interruptions, more deliberate periods of concentration, more awareness of where mental energy was being directed. The changes seemed minor at first, yet their effects were surprisingly significant. Thoughts became clearer. Decisions became easier. Tasks that once felt overwhelming became manageable simply because they were receiving undivided attention. It became obvious that progress had never been hiding behind some mysterious lack of ability. Progress had been waiting behind layers of distraction. The potential to move forward had always existed. It was simply buried beneath noise. That realization changed the way I viewed attention forever. Focus is often described as a tool for productivity, but its influence extends far beyond work or achievement. It shapes perception itself. Whatever consistently occupies the mind begins influencing emotions, decisions, priorities, and behavior. In many ways, attention becomes the architect of experience. A scattered mind creates a scattered life. A directed mind creates direction. This is why protecting focus matters so deeply. Not because it guarantees success, but because it creates the conditions where meaningful progress can finally take root. And once those conditions exist, the path forward becomes far easier to recognize. As attention becomes less scattered, another truth begins to reveal itself. The obstacles that once seemed massive and unavoidable often look very different when examined closely. For a long time, I believed progress was being blocked by external circumstances. Lack of time, lack of opportunity, lack of resources. It felt reasonable to think that way because external problems are easy to identify. They are visible. They have names. They provide convenient explanations for why things are not moving forward. Yet the more honestly I observed my own behavior, the more I realized that many of the barriers standing in front of me were not outside my control at all. They existed within my own thinking. They appeared in moments of hesitation, in moments of doubt, in moments when fear quietly disguised itself as caution and convinced me to stay exactly where I was. This realization was not particularly comfortable. Most people would rather believe that circumstances are responsible for their lack of progress because circumstances feel easier to blame. When the obstacle exists outside of you, responsibility can be postponed. Change can be delayed. Action can wait for better conditions. But when the obstacle is internal, the conversation becomes different. Suddenly, there are fewer excuses available. The mind begins confronting patterns it would rather avoid. Patterns that have existed for years, sometimes for decades. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of discovering that an effort may not produce the desired result. These fears rarely announce themselves openly. Instead, they appear in subtle ways. They encourage delay. They encourage overthinking. They encourage endless preparation without meaningful action. The Stoics recognized this tendency long ago. They understood that the human mind often creates suffering long before reality provides any reason for it. A person imagines future problems and begins experiencing the emotional weight of those problems as if they have already happened. The body reacts, the emotions respond, anxiety grows, yet the event being feared may never occur. In many cases, the imagined outcome is far worse than reality itself. This creates a strange situation where a person becomes trapped by possibilities rather than facts. Energy is spent fighting battles that exist only in anticipation. Days become consumed by worries that have no physical presence beyond the mind creating them. The result is paralysis disguised as caution. When viewed from a distance, it becomes obvious how many opportunities disappear because of imagined outcomes. Projects remain unfinished because someone fears criticism. Conversations never happen because someone fears rejection. Goals remain untouched because someone fears failure. Entire chapters of life remain unwritten because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Yet uncertainty is present in nearly everything worthwhile. There is no meaningful pursuit that arrives with guarantees attached. No important decision comes with complete certainty. As Seneca wrote, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Waiting for certainty often means waiting forever. The future remains unknown regardless of how much thought is devoted to predicting it. The question is not whether uncertainty will exist. It will. The question is whether uncertainty will be allowed to decide the direction of a life. For years, I believed confidence would eventually arrive and make action easier. I treated confidence as a prerequisite, something that needed to be obtained before difficult steps could be taken. The logic seemed sensible at the time. Build confidence first, then take action. Feel ready first, then move forward. Yet experience repeatedly proved the opposite. Confidence rarely appears before action. It emerges because of action. The first step feels uncomfortable. The second step feels slightly easier. The third step feels more familiar. Eventually, the thing that once felt intimidating becomes normal. Not because fear disappeared, but because repeated exposure reduced its influence. Action teaches lessons that thought alone cannot provide. This is why courage is often misunderstood. Many people assume courage means operating without fear. They imagine courageous individuals possess some special ability that removes uncertainty from difficult situations. The reality is far less dramatic and far more practical. Courage is simply the decision to move despite uncertainty. Fear may still be present. Doubt may still exist. Questions may remain unanswered. Yet action happens anyway. Every time this occurs, the mind learns something valuable. It learns that discomfort can be survived. It learns that uncertainty is manageable. It learns that growth frequently exists on the other side of hesitation. The interesting thing about these lessons is that they rarely arrive all at once. They accumulate gradually. One decision leads to another. One small act of courage creates evidence that future acts of courage are possible. Over time, the relationship with fear begins changing. Instead of viewing fear as a stop sign, it becomes information, a signal that something meaningful may exist beyond the current comfort zone. This shift changes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Energy that was once spent avoiding discomfort becomes available for progress. Attention that was once consumed by imagined problems becomes available for real solutions. As this pattern continues, another realization begins to emerge. The strongest people are not necessarily those who experience the least fear. They are often the people who have developed the habit of acting despite it. They understand that readiness is rarely a feeling. It is a decision. They stop waiting for perfect conditions because they recognize that perfect conditions rarely arrive. Instead, they work with what is available. They take the next step they can see, then the next, then the next. Through this process, confidence grows naturally because it is being built on evidence rather than hope. That evidence becomes difficult to ignore. Every challenge faced directly becomes proof of capability. Every obstacle navigated becomes proof of adaptability. Every uncertain situation survived becomes proof that the mind is stronger than it first believed. As Epictetus reminded us, difficulties show what men are. Gradually, the focus shifts away from fear itself and toward the person being shaped through the process. This is where meaningful growth often begins. Not when uncertainty disappears, but when uncertainty loses its ability to dictate behavior. The path forward becomes clearer because action has replaced hesitation. And once movement begins, possibilities that once seemed distant start feeling remarkably close. As these changes continued to unfold, I began noticing something that I had overlooked for years. My energy was different, not dramatically different overnight, but noticeably different in a way that affected almost every part of my day. Tasks that once felt heavier seemed easier to approach. Decisions that used to require constant effort felt less draining. Even moments of frustration seemed easier to manage. At first, I assumed this change was coming from better habits or improved focus alone, but the deeper I looked, the clearer the real reason became. I had finally stopped treating my body as something separate from my goals. For a long time, I viewed physical well-being as a secondary concern, something to address later, after work was finished, after responsibilities were handled, after more important priorities were taken care of. Yet that way of thinking quietly created problems I did not fully understand at the time. I was expecting strong performance from a system that was receiving very little support. This is a mistake many people make without realizing it. They pursue productivity while neglecting recovery. They chase discipline while ignoring exhaustion. They expect mental clarity while surviving on inadequate sleep, poor nutrition, and constant stress. Then they become frustrated when motivation disappears or focus becomes difficult to maintain. The problem is rarely a lack of desire. Most people genuinely want to improve. The problem is that they are attempting to build a stronger future while weakening the foundation that supports it. There is only so much a person can accomplish when operating from a place of constant depletion. The mind may have ambitions, but the body ultimately provides the energy required to pursue them. When that energy becomes compromised, everything else becomes more difficult than it needs to be. The interesting thing is that physical neglect often happens gradually. Few people intentionally decide to damage their well-being. Instead, they make small compromises. A little less sleep, a little more stress, a little less movement, a little less recovery. Each decision appears harmless in isolation. Life becomes busy. Responsibilities increase. Priorities shift. The body adapts remarkably well for a while, which makes the problem even harder to notice. Yet eventually, the effects begin appearing. Energy becomes inconsistent. Focus becomes weaker. Patience becomes harder to maintain. Small challenges feel larger than they actually are. The person may assume they need more discipline when in reality they may simply need more rest. The Stoics approached this differently. While they did not obsess over physical appearance, they understood the value of physical resilience. They recognized that a strong body could support a strong mind, not because strength itself was the ultimate goal, but because endurance mattered. Stability mattered. The ability to remain effective under pressure mattered. Physical training was often viewed as preparation for life's inevitable difficulties. It taught persistence. It taught discomfort tolerance. It taught the ability to continue moving forward even when conditions were not ideal. These lessons extended far beyond exercise. They became part of a person's character, part of the way challenges were approached and handled. As I reflected on this perspective, I began noticing how closely physical energy and mental performance were connected. On days when I slept well, everything seemed clearer. Decisions required less effort. Focus lasted longer. Emotional reactions became easier to manage. On days when rest was neglected, the opposite often occurred. Minor frustrations felt larger. Concentration became inconsistent. Motivation seemed unreliable. The circumstances of life had not changed. The responsibilities remained the same. Yet my ability to respond to those circumstances changed significantly. That realization was impossible to ignore. The quality of my energy was influencing the quality of my decisions, and the quality of my decisions was influencing the direction of my life. This is why energy creates opportunity in ways that are often underestimated. When a person feels physically strong, challenges appear more manageable. Tasks feel less intimidating. Obstacles seem less permanent. There is greater willingness to take action because the body possesses the resources required to support that action. This does not eliminate difficulty. Problems still exist. Responsibilities still demand attention. But the capacity to handle those demands improves. A stronger foundation creates greater resilience, and resilience allows progress to continue even when circumstances become uncomfortable. What surprised me most was how simple many of the necessary changes actually were. More consistent sleep, more movement throughout the day, better hydration, greater awareness of recovery. None of these habits were revolutionary. None of them required extreme effort. Yet together they created noticeable improvements. The body responded positively because it was finally receiving what it needed, rather than being expected to operate indefinitely under strain. The improvements extended beyond physical well-being. Focus improved, patience improved, consistency improved. Habits that once felt difficult began requiring less effort because the energy needed to support them was finally available. There is a tendency in modern culture to search for complex solutions to problems that often have simple foundations. People look for advanced strategies while overlooking basic necessities. They search for motivation while neglecting sleep. They search for productivity while neglecting recovery. They search for discipline while neglecting health. Yet sustainable growth rarely emerges from constant exhaustion. It emerges from balance, from respecting the systems that make progress possible in the first place. The longer I observed this connection, the more obvious it became that physical well-being was never separate from personal growth. It was part of it. Every goal depended upon energy. Every habit depended upon energy. Every decision depended upon energy. When that energy improved, opportunities seemed to appear more frequently, not because life had changed, but because I was better equipped to engage with it. The same challenges existed. The same responsibilities remained. The difference was that I now had the strength to meet them with greater clarity, greater consistency, and far less resistance than before. As momentum began building, I discovered something that seemed obvious once I saw it, yet had escaped my attention for years. Most people are making more progress than they believe they are. The problem is not always a lack of growth. The problem is a lack of recognition. There is a tendency to become so focused on the destination that every step along the way feels insignificant. The mind keeps shifting its attention toward what remains unfinished. Goals become moving targets. Standards become increasingly difficult to satisfy. No matter how much progress is made, attention quickly moves to the next problem, the next challenge, the next gap between where life is and where life could be. At first, this approach appears productive. It creates pressure to improve. It creates urgency. Yet it also creates a strange blindness. A person can be moving forward consistently while feeling as though nothing is changing at all. This pattern is more common than most people realize. Someone develops healthier habits but focuses only on the weight they have not yet lost. Someone becomes more disciplined but notices only the moments they fall short. Someone improves their focus but remains frustrated by occasional distractions. The mind becomes trained to search for deficiencies instead of evidence of growth. Over time, this creates an unfair relationship with progress. Achievements are minimized. Improvements are dismissed. Victories are treated as expectations rather than accomplishments. The result is a constant feeling of inadequacy, even when meaningful changes are taking place. A person can spend years improving while still feeling stuck because they never pause long enough to recognize how far they have already come. The Stoics understood the importance of reflection for precisely this reason. They recognized that growth requires awareness. Without awareness, progress remains invisible. Without reflection, lessons remain incomplete. Many of them practiced a simple routine at the end of the day. They reviewed their actions honestly. They examined their choices. They considered where they had succeeded and where they could improve. Importantly, this was not done as a form of self-punishment. It was not an exercise in criticism. It was an exercise in learning. The purpose was not to condemn mistakes, but to understand them. The purpose was not to chase perfection, but to cultivate wisdom. By observing their own behavior consistently, they developed a clearer understanding of themselves. This idea began changing the way I measured my own progress. Instead of focusing exclusively on distant outcomes, I started paying attention to daily actions. The shift was subtle, but it transformed the entire experience of growth. Rather than asking whether I had reached a major goal, I began asking whether I had improved in some small way. Did I keep a promise I made to myself? Did I remain focused when distraction appeared? Did I respond calmly to a difficult situation? Did I choose discipline over comfort when given the opportunity? The answers were often simple. Sometimes they seemed almost insignificant. Yet those small moments carried more meaning than I initially realized because they represented evidence that change was happening, evidence that effort was producing results. The more I paid attention to these small victories, the more I noticed how easily they had been overlooked in the past. Human beings often reserve celebration for dramatic achievements, promotions, milestones, major breakthroughs. These moments deserve recognition, but they are relatively rare. Daily life is shaped by much smaller decisions, a difficult conversation handled with maturity, a healthy choice made when no one was watching, a commitment honored despite inconvenience. These moments rarely receive applause, yet they are often responsible for creating the larger achievements that eventually arrive. The visible outcome may receive attention, but it is usually built upon hundreds of invisible decisions that came before it. Recognizing this changed my relationship with motivation. For a long time, motivation felt unreliable because it depended on visible results. If progress was obvious, motivation grew. If results were delayed, motivation faded. But reflection created a different source of encouragement. It revealed evidence that change was happening even when external outcomes had not yet caught up. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." That perspective made consistency easier to maintain because progress no longer depended entirely on future rewards. Progress could be found in the present moment, in behavior, in the growing ability to act according to values rather than impulses. And that realization created a sense of stability that motivation alone could never provide. There is also something powerful about ending a day with evidence rather than assumptions. Many people go to sleep carrying vague feelings of disappointment. They remember what they failed to accomplish. They remember mistakes. They remember unfinished tasks. Yet memory has a tendency to distort reality when left unchecked. Reflection provides balance. It creates an opportunity to acknowledge effort honestly, not to exaggerate accomplishments, not to ignore shortcomings, simply to see the day clearly. When viewed through that lens, progress becomes easier to recognize. A difficult day may still contain valuable lessons. A challenging week may still contain meaningful growth. Improvement becomes visible because attention is finally directed toward it. Over time, these observations begin accumulating. Individual victories may seem small, but their effects compound. A person who consistently recognizes progress develops a healthier relationship with growth itself. They become less dependent on external validation because they can see their own development. They become less discouraged by temporary setbacks because they possess evidence of their ability to continue moving forward. Most importantly, they begin building something deeper than motivation. Motivation fluctuates. Enthusiasm comes and goes. External circumstances change. Self-respect operates differently. It grows through repeated acts of integrity, through repeated demonstrations that actions align with intentions, through repeated proof that commitments matter. Eventually, the collection of small victories forms a larger story, not a story of perfection, but a story of effort, a story of persistence, a story of gradual improvement built through countless ordinary moments. The person looking back can see more than isolated successes. They can see a pattern. They can see growth unfolding across days, weeks, and months. And once that pattern becomes visible, confidence begins resting on something much stronger than temporary emotion. It rests on evidence. The quiet evidence created by showing up consistently, learning continuously, and refusing to ignore the progress that was there all along. As all of these lessons began connecting together, a deeper realization slowly emerged. None of these habits were really about productivity in the way I had once imagined. They were never about checking more boxes, completing more tasks, or squeezing every possible ounce of efficiency from the day. In fact, the more I reflected on the changes taking place, the more I understood that productivity was simply a byproduct. Something else was happening beneath the surface, something far more important. The habits were teaching me how to regain ownership over parts of my life that had gradually been handed away without realizing it. Not handed away to another person, but to impulses, distractions, emotions, and circumstances. Little by little, choices that should have been deliberate had become automatic. Reactions that should have been examined had become habitual. Days that should have been guided by intention had become guided by momentum. The habits were not changing my schedule as much as they were changing my relationship with myself. This idea sits at the heart of something the Stoics understood remarkably well. They believed that freedom was often misunderstood. Most people imagine freedom as the ability to do whatever they want, whenever they want. Yet that definition quickly begins to fall apart when examined closely. A person who cannot control their impulses is not truly free. A person who is constantly controlled by anger, fear, anxiety, distraction, or external approval is not truly free either. They may possess options, but their inner world remains governed by forces they do not fully understand. The Stoics proposed a different kind of freedom, one built through self-mastery, not mastery over other people, not mastery over unpredictable events, mastery over thoughts, choices, and responses, a freedom that cannot be taken away because it originates from within. The more I thought about this, the more I began noticing how much energy had previously been spent trying to control things that were never fully mine to control in the first place. Outcomes, opinions, circumstances, timing. There was always some future event that seemed necessary before peace of mind could finally arrive, some achievement that needed to happen, some condition that needed to improve, some uncertainty that needed to disappear. Yet life rarely operates according to those expectations. Delays happen, plans change, unexpected difficulties appear without warning. The person who depends entirely on external conditions for stability often finds themselves trapped in a cycle of frustration because external conditions are constantly changing. The world refuses to follow a script. It moves according to its own rhythm. What began changing was not the unpredictability of life. That remained exactly as it had always been. What changed was my relationship with it. Challenges still appeared. Problems still demanded attention. There were still moments of disappointment, uncertainty, and frustration. The difference was that these experiences gradually stopped feeling like personal attacks. They stopped feeling like evidence that something had gone wrong. Instead, they became opportunities to practice the very qualities I had been trying to develop. Patience during delays, discipline during discomfort, composure during uncertainty. The obstacle itself was no longer the primary focus. The response became the focus. And that shift changed the entire experience. This is where many people become stuck without realizing it. They spend years asking whether life is fair, whether circumstances are favorable, whether the conditions around them are ideal. These questions are understandable, but they often lead nowhere useful because they focus attention on things that cannot be fully controlled. A more productive question begins to emerge when attention returns inward. Not whether circumstances are perfect, but whether character is improving. Not whether every obstacle disappears, but whether resilience is growing. Not whether discomfort can be avoided, but whether it can be handled more effectively than before. These questions create movement because they place responsibility back into the hands of the person asking them. Over time, this perspective begins influencing everything. Criticism becomes easier to navigate because self-worth is no longer entirely dependent on approval. Delays become easier to tolerate because progress is measured by effort rather than immediate outcomes. Difficult conversations become less intimidating because discomfort is no longer treated as something that must always be avoided. As Epictetus observed, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. A growing sense of stability begins to emerge when identity is rooted in principles rather than circumstances. The external world continues to change, but the internal foundation becomes stronger. This does not eliminate emotional reactions. It does not create some unrealistic state of permanent calm. It simply creates more space between events and responses, more room to choose rather than react automatically. What surprised me most was how ordinary this process actually felt. There was no dramatic transformation, no single moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, the changes accumulated gradually through daily choices, small acts of discipline, small moments of awareness, small opportunities to respond differently than before. None of them seemed significant in isolation, yet together they created a noticeable shift in perspective. Life stopped feeling like something that was happening to me and started feeling like something I was actively participating in. The difference may sound subtle, but its effects were profound. Eventually, obstacles began looking different as well. Not because they became easier, but because they were being interpreted differently. Difficult situations no longer appeared solely as interruptions to progress. They became part of the process itself. Every challenge contained an opportunity to practice patience. Every setback contained an opportunity to practice persistence. Every disappointment contained an opportunity to practice perspective. The obstacle and the training became inseparable. Growth was no longer postponed until difficulties disappeared. Growth was happening through the difficulties. That realization may be the most valuable lesson of all. Every day presents another opportunity to strengthen the qualities that matter most, not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through ordinary decisions repeated consistently over time. The world will always contain uncertainty. Circumstances will continue changing. Challenges will continue appearing. Yet a person who develops mastery over their own responses carries something far more valuable than certainty. They carry stability. And from that stability comes a kind of freedom that no external success can fully provide, because it is built upon something that remains available regardless of what the world decides to do next. A better life is rarely built through one extraordinary moment. It is built through ordinary moments, repeated with intention. One decision, one habit, one act of discipline at a time. The person you become tomorrow is being shaped by the choices you make today, even when nobody else can see them. If something in this reflection resonated with you, don't let it end here. Choose one of the videos on your screen and continue the journey. Every lesson is another opportunity to strengthen your mind, deepen your perspective, and move closer to the person you're capable of becoming. Thank you for spending this time with Stoic Journal. More importantly, thank you for investing in yourself. Until next time, stay patient, stay disciplined, and remember, character is built in the moments most people overlook.